Hello dear students. Today we will discuss the new theme about inflammation. What is this inflammation? Definition. Inflammation is complex local vascular mesenchymal reaction of an organism aimed at the destruction of causative agent, etiological agent, and tissue structure recovery. Which etiological factors of inflammation? There are three main groups of factors in etiology. Biological, what's this? Bacteria, viruses, parasites, and other immunocomplexes. Chemical substances and drugs, and physical substances as temperature, mechanical trauma, irradiation, and other. Clinical signs of inflammation. You know that rubor, tumor, rise temperature, and function leisure. Reading is result of arterial hyperemia, edema, tumor, temperature rise, pain as a result of pressure of edema liquid, and function derangement. Which morphological signs or stages of inflammation? First stage, alteration, the next, exudation, and third, proliferation. And more about each of them. What's this alteration, this first initial stage of inflammation? We see dystrophy and necrosis in the parenchyma and stroma, and release of bioactive substances. Please remember important information. Any inflammation begins with alteration. Inflammation triggering mechanism, release of bioactive substances. Which bioactive substances you must know? First, plasma or circulating bioactive substances. For example, kallikrein-kinin system, complement system, blood circulation system, and cellular bioactive substances, substances of labrocytes, thrombocytes, basophils, macrophages, lymphocytes, fibroblasts, and neutrophils, etc. In the next stage, exudation. It's a complicated process of effusion formation. Exudate consists of two parts: liquid part with water, proteins, mineral salts, and cells, plasma and tissue cells. In this stage, two main components of exudation phase. At first, microcirculatory changes and cellular reactions. In first stage, in microcirculatory changes, we see at first short-term vasoconstriction, the next vasodilatation and stasis of blood, the next increase of vascular wall permeability, and increase of fluid transition from microcirculatory system into tissues. Due to cellular reaction, what can we see? At first, marginal or edge staining of leukocytes. The next, active migration of inflammatory cells from the blood into lesion area. At first, we see migration of neutrophil, active migration of neutrophils, and passive migration of erythrocytes. And in the second stage, active migration of macrophages. As a result of migration of macrophages, we see phagocytosis. At first, recognition, the next, absorption and destruction of microorganisms in the help of peroxidase, myeloperoxidase, lysosome ferments. As a result, we see formation of exudate. You must know a differential diagnostic between exudate and transudate. Due to transudate, we see normal vascular wall permeability. Due to exudate, increased. Proteins content. In transudate, up to 1.5 gram in liters. Due to exudate, more than 1.5 gram in liter. Proteins type. Due to transudate, light proteins, albumins. Due to exudate, all types of proteins. Absence or present fibrin. Due to transudate, absent. Due to exudate, present. And absent present of cells in zone of transudate or exudate. Due to transudate, we can't see any cells. Due to exudate, we see cells of inflammation, leukocytes and macrophages. In this picture, you can see normal vessel in the left side and vessel due to inflammation into the inflammatory zone. We can see hyperemia, arterial hyperemia, increased vessel wall permeability, and migration of water, proteins, and inflammatory cells into the tissues from vessel volume. In this photo, you can see angio or leukocytes standing into the small vessel, and migration, active migration of leukocyte into the tissue in zone of inflammation. In this picture, you can see inflammatory zone, arterial hyperemia, and migration of many cells of inflammation into the tissues. In this slide, you can see phagocytosis, migration, rolling, adhesion, diapedesis, and hematoxis, and phagocytosis and killing. In the last stage, proliferation, what can we see? Increase of cell quantity in the inflammation zone of the local histiogenous and hematogenous origin. Which histiogenous cells we see in zone of inflammation? Epithelial cells and fibroblast fibrocyte cells of connective tissue. Which hematogenous cells we see in zone of inflammation? Monocytes become macrophages. Macrophages become epithelioid cells. Epithelioid cells become giant cells. B lymphocytes become labrocytes. Labrocytes become plasma cells. Neutrophils are dying and T lymphocytes are dying too. In this photo, you can see many cells of inflammation. Macrophages, leukocytes, plasma cells, T lymphocytes, erythrocytes, and etc. In this photo, you can see giant cells of foreign body. In this photo, you can see giant cells of Pirogov Langhans. In this photo, you can see inflammation due to tuberculosis, presence of lymphocytes, epithelioid cells, and single giant cells of Pirogov Langhans. In this photo, you can see accumulation of macrophages, granuloma. What about course of inflammation? There are three main courses: acute, subacute, and chronic. And according to the morphology, inflammation forms can be exudative and proliferative. What about exudative inflammation? Definition: exudation prevalence are alteration and proliferation with the reaction of microcirculatory bed and exudate formation. I repeat, exudate composition: fluid, proteins more than 1.5 gram in liter, blood uniform elements, leukocytes, macrophages, erythrocytes, and other. Cells of local tissue, epithelial cells, fibroblast fibrocytes, lysis or decay products, necrotic masses, and microbes. There are 7 types of exudative inflammation. Serous, fibrinous, and suppurative are main forms. Catarrhal, hemorrhagic, putrid, and mixed are secondary forms. And more about each of them. What about serous inflammation? Serous inflammation we see in mucous and serous membranes, rarely in the lungs, Manning's vasculosa, and skin. Exudate composition, prevalence fluid in this type of inflammation, and plasma proteins, single cells. Serous inflammation looks like as a transudate. Outcome, exudate resorption, this favorable outcome. In this photo you can see herpes inflammation with formation of serous inflammation with bubbles with fluid. Serous inflammation, many bubbles with fluid. The result of burn, formation of a large bubble with fluid. Histologically, we see accumulation of liquid and single cells. In this photo, you can see serous inflammation, serous fluid. This fluid looks like as a transudate. The next type, fibrinous inflammation. Localization in mucous and serous membranes, rarely in the lungs. If we see accumulation of fibrinous inflammation in the mucous membrane, we can see 2 variants, crupose and diphtheritic. Crupose in the single epithelium, in the prismatic epithelium. For example, in the trachea, bronchi. If we see formation of fibrinous inflammation in the flat epithelium, we tell about diphtheritic with deep necrosis, rough films formation. Look, in this photo you can see fibrinous inflammation in the pericardium with villi formation, villi of fibrin. The hair heart looks like the hair heart in the left side. In the right side you can see diphtheria, disease with diphtheritic inflammation in the tonsils and crupose inflammation in the trachea. In this microphoto you can see fibrinous inflammation in the serous membrane, pink masses. In this photo you can see rough films formation due to diphtheria in the tonsils. Diphtheria 2. In this photo you can see crupose pneumonia in the left side. Histological examination of crupose pneumonia. Many leukocytes into the alveoli and villi of fibrin of pink color. Diphtheritic colitis due to dysentery. Rough films in the large intestine. Histological examination. Deep necrosis with formation of rough films. Which outcomes of fibrinous inflammation? Due to crupose inflammation, we see more favorable outcome. Exudate resorption, extraction of films, light films, and epithelialization without deep necrosis. Due to diphtheritic inflammation and due to fibrinous inflammation in the serous membranes, we can see exudate organization with formation of commissuries and ulcer formation after extraction of diphtheritic films. The next type of inflammation exudative inflammation, suppurative inflammation, or purulent inflammation. Exudate basis is neutrophilic leukocytes or purulent bodies. Localization. This type of inflammation we can see in many organs and tissues, in all organs and tissues. There are 4 forms of suppurative inflammation: abscess, phlegmon, empyema, and apostema abscesses. Abscess is local form of suppurative inflammation. Look, in this photo you can see abscess formation with formation of pus. Many abscesses in the liver. Histologically, we see accumulation of neutrophilic leukocytes in the right side of photo with lysis of tissues. In this photo, you can see phlegmon formation in the neck, the spreading form of suppurative inflammation. Phlegmon in the leg. In this photo, you can see empyema. Empyema is suppurative inflammation in the cavities, in the pleural cavity, for example. This very serious type of inflammation with lysis of pleura. Very serious form with unfavorable outcome. Suppurative inflammation in the abdominal cavity with pus formation. And apostema abscesses, many small abscesses in the organ, in the lung, in the liver, in the kidneys. This type of inflammation is unfavorable with the lysis of tissues and cells and formation of cavities and rough scarring after this type of inflammation. The next inflammation type, hemorrhagic inflammation. In the exudate, we see a prevalence of erythrocytes, and this type of inflammation looks like as a hemorrhage. This type of inflammation we can see in the very dangerous diseases, in the plague, in the anthrax, due to serious form of influenza. Erythrocytes can lysis, but this type of inflammation, I repeat, we see due to very serious diseases. In this photo you can see hemorrhagic inflammation in the mucous membrane. So looks like as a hemorrhagic inflammation due to plague in the Manning's vasculosa. And histologically, we see a picture as a hemorrhage. Hemorrhagic inflammation in the lung due to serious form of influenza. The next type of inflammation, putrid inflammation. This type of inflammation develops by joining of putrefactive microorganisms, for example, Clostridium. This type of inflammation is very serious. Localization: postpartum uterus, wounds in the large intestine of newborn. Outcome of this inflammation is unfavorable. Look, in this photo you can see putrid inflammation. Catarrhal inflammation. This variant of serous inflammation. More often we see this type of inflammation in the mucous membranes due to action of viruses. And exudate contains slime or mucus. There are 3 variants of catarrhal inflammation: serous catarrh, mucous catarrh, and purulent catarrh. Outcome of this type of inflammation is favorable with the resorption of exudate. Look, in this photo you can see catarrhal inflammation due to respiratory viral infection. Catarrhal inflammation in the stomach, gastritis, catarrhal gastritis. Catarrhal tracheitis due to influenza, light form. Catarrhal tracheitis due to influenza. And the last type of inflammation, mixed. More often we see mixed inflammation as a result of action of many inflammatory factors. For example, serous fibrinous, serous purulent, serous hemorrhagic, or many components, more than 2 components. Serous hemorrhagic with purulent component. The next information about productive or proliferative type of inflammation. Definition. Inflammation form when the proliferation phase prevails upon alteration and exudation. I repeat, we see proliferation of many cells in the inflammatory zone. Which cells? I repeat, monocytes become macrophages in the inflammatory zone. Lymphocytes T, lymphocytes B become plasma cells. Eosinophils, mast cells, leukocytes, fibroblasts, epithelioid cells, giant cells of Pyrogov Langhans, and cells of foreign bodies. In this photo, you can see erythrocytes and leukocytes and lymphocytes. Accumulation of macrophages, giant cell of foreign body, inflammation due to tuberculosis, epithelioid cells, lymphocytes, and single cell of giant cell of Pyrogov Langhans. There are 3 types of proliferative inflammation. Interstitial, inflammation with formation of polyps and pointed condylomas, and granulomatous. More about each of them. Interstitial inflammation. Localization in the parenchymatous organs, in the liver, in the kidneys, and myocardium. Anatomically, organ practically without changes. Histologically, we see accumulation of many proliferative cells between cardiomyocytes, hepatocytes, and nephrocytes. What can we see? Accumulation of histiocytes, lymphocytes, macrophages, eosinophils, and many other cells. As a result, in the parenchyma, we see dystrophy and necrobiotic processes. And in the outcome, we see sclerosis in the organ. Hepatosclerosis, cardiosclerosis, sclerosis of the kidney. In this photo, you can see diffuse interstitial inflammation in the heart and local interstitial inflammation. Result of this inflammation, sclerosis, cardiosclerosis. The next proliferative type of inflammation, inflammation with formation of polyps and pointed condylomas. Where can we see? In the mucous membranes, we see formation of polyps with prismatic epithelium. And in the flat epithelium, we see formation of pointed condylomas. As a result, polyps with the formation of stroma, growth of connective tissue, and this stroma covered with the prismatic epithelium. Condylomas, many small formations with stroma covered with multi-layer flat epithelium. Look, in this photo you can see a polyp in the small intestine. Histologically, we see stroma growth and prismatic epithelium. Pointed condylomas in the skin. Histologically, we see flat epithelium in this formation. And the last type of proliferative inflammation, granulomatous inflammation. This type of inflammation with formation of granulomas in case of infectious, infectious allergic diseases, around the animal parasites and foreign bodies. What's this granuloma or nodule? This focal cluster of the cells able the phagocytosis. Classification of granulomatous diseases. There are 4 types. Granulomatous disease of infectious etiology, of non-infectious etiology, drug-induced granulomatous diseases, and granulomatous diseases with undetermined etiology. More often we see infectious granulomas formation. Infectious granulomas can be specific and non-specific. What about specific granulomatous diseases? Due to tuberculosis, granuloma has name great tubercle. Anatomically, this formation has small size, about 2, 3, 4 millimeters. In the center of this granuloma, we see caseous necrosis. In the periphery zone of necrosis, we see accumulation of 3 types of cells: epithelioid cells, lymphocytes, and single giant cells of Pirogov-Langerhans. Look, this anatomical change, miliary tuberculosis, many small gray tubercles in the lung. Histologically, in the center of granuloma with the caseous necrosis. In the periphery zone, lymphocytes, round cells, oval epithelioid cells, and single Pirogov-Langerhans giant cells. Outcome of granuloma due to tuberculosis, light scarring. The next specific granulomatous disease, syphilis. In short period, we see formation of granuloma with name gumma. Gumma has large size, about several centimeters, 5-7 centimeters, in the soft tissues and bones in many internal organs. In the center of this granuloma, we see caseous necrosis with liquefaction. Surrounded, we see formation of plasma cells, plasmacytes, this main cell, lymphocytes, and epithelioid cells. Outcome of this granuloma is unfavorable, rough scarring with deformation of tissues and organs. Look, in this photo you can see granuloma formation in the nose. This result of formation of gumma, rough scarring with deformation of tissues. Gumma in the lung. Many gummas in the liver with deformation of organ with rough scarring. Histologically, number 1 is necrosis, and number 2 in the periphery zone many cells with prevalence of plasma cells. The next specific granulomatous disease, leprosy. Granuloma has name leproma. What can we see? We see accumulation of many cells, but specific cells has name Virchow cells, macrophages with accumulation of etiological factor. But besides macrophages, we see plasmocytes and lymphocytes. Outcome of this granuloma is rough deformation, rough sclerosis with deformation of tissues. In this photo, you can see a result of rough scarring, lion face. Inflammation due to leprosy, leproma. Histologically, accumulation of Virchow cells. Etiological factor due to special staining. The next specific granulomatous disease, scleroma. Granuloma has name scleroma 2. Represented mainly by plasmatic and epithelioid cells. Special cells are highly involved as a result of transformation of plasmatic cells, and specific second cells are Mikulicz cells, these macrophages containing the pathogen of Volkovich-Frisch bacillus. Look, in this picture you can see rhinoscleroma, formation of scleroma in the nose cavity. Histologically, in the upper side, Mikulicz cells and hyaline balls in the down side. Outcome, rough scarring. What about non-specific granulomatous inflammation? Due to many diseases, we can see formation of non-specific infectious granulomas. Due to rheumatism, due to typhoid fever, due to spotted fever, actinomycosis, aspergillosis, inflammation around parasites and foreign bodies, we see accumulation of macrophages due to non-specific inflammation. Due to rheumatism, a formation of granuloma, non-specific granuloma in the myocardium. Formation of non-specific granuloma as a macrophages accumulation. Due to typhoid fever in the small intestine, in the lymphoid apparatus. Formation of many cells, macrophages. Outcome. The most frequent outcome of granulomatous processes is scarring. Thank you for your attention.